here, I'm sorry for the example again on Google. Again, I'm not paid by Google. And the CV profile the person, and at some point you stop the search and you do a little circle around it. And you say, that's the substance, I know enough of this guy. Okay? So, you'll notice that when you do a CV, you're not doing something which is individual. It's not an individual, because the CV is made of a list of papers which are distributed collectively, of places, diploma, all sorts of other things which are collective. But you collect them in a way which means that the more you know, the more attributes there is, the more bigger the network, the more individualized is the element. This paradox, which is not a paradox for actor network theory, but which was a paradox for every critique of actor network theory, which means probably lots of people in this room, and certainly lots of people. It's a paradox because people never realize that the more you individualize, the more you collectivize. Collecting is what individualizes. And this distance is not between micro and macro, it's just the distance between the dot at the beginning and the search when you stop the search. And here I suppose I stay inside a data set. I'm not talking about the limit of a data set, which would be another difficulty. So the argument is that we are not saying this is the end of the distinction between micro and macro. We are saying the more we are used to this practice of digital navigation, the easier it is not to think in the term of a two-level standpoint. So we habituate ourselves to the possibility of looking at organization in a flat way. Of course, flat is a word which is disputed. And that's my third argument, which is what this argument about profile and navigation means to get the whole. Can we now look seriously at the common experience we always have, and yet which is never registered by the language we use, that the whole is smaller and not bigger than the part. Every one of us is infinitely bigger, made of many more parts than any of the institution and organization in which we enter. So that's my third point, which is in fact very easy to do now that we have this, if you have accepted the two other points. I mean, not accepted, but at least for the remnant of the reminder of this talk. Usually when people tackle this question, not in organization studies so much, but in social theory, especially when they are coming from physics or coming from mathematics, they want to model social phenomena, they say. And they start with atomic element, endowed with very, very little property. Think of Schelling's model of ghettoization. Then they list the smallest numbers of interacting rules, and then they let the computer do the job, and they obtain something which is, they call emergent structures, whatever is the name. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar. There are dozens and dozens of these little tests. And they say, you, the sociologist, or you, the qualitative social scientist, anthropologist, you don't know your business because you do things which are too complicated. You do interviews, you do description of real situation. This is too complicated. We start with very simple assumption, and we get the structure with very simple rules of interaction. Which means that they explain queues, traffic jams, and the aula. Basically, that's what physics explains when you do this sort of phenomenon. Now, I'm asking you, how much time do we spend in a whole life in an aula? And in a queue, well, maybe some of that traffic jam lasts a bit more, especially if you live in Los Angeles. But still, this is not what the social is massively made of. Right? There are endless numbers of phenomena which are not queues, which are not traffic jams, which are not aula. Even though the aula is very interesting to study. So, the question is, can we absorb the phenomena where neither the notion of atomistic entity, nor interaction, nor structure are visible? And that's what I mean by reassembling organization. The three main elements, the individual, the interaction and the whole are artifacts of the way we handled data. That's my argument. It's a bit extreme, but it makes sense. So that I mean, it makes sense for me. And actually, being a preacher here means quite a lot. So I'm preaching, actually. Brothers and sisters, you need a real tone of voice to preach. I can imitate it perfectly. Just so that there is no difficulty here, don't confuse this argument with a return to the holistic argument, because in this view, which has been actor network theory for years, the distinction between the holistic and atomistic is completely moot, because in both cases, you have something I call a dispatcher, a sort of mythical entity which is distributing roles and functions. The atomistic people, the people who do these models like Schelling and so on, the people who are doing emergent structure, the people who do system theory, the people who do sort of autopoietic systems and so on, in fact always end up with a dispatcher, even if they study swarms of ants or flocks of birds or olla. But just the difference is that the dispatcher arrives after. And the holistic guys, the dispatcher, they start with, and then they distribute individual roles. It makes absolutely no difference to my argument if you start with the atomistic or if you start with the holistic. Because my argument is precisely that it's possible to get out of this trap in which organization studies and social theory more generally has been captive, so to speak, to use an argument a bit too big. So let me give an example. If you begin to assemble CVs, which again are not individual CV, because every CV is actually a network with lots of intersections. So if I begin to assemble the CVs of the people in my school, I will have lots of intersections because they have been sometimes in the same school, sometimes they got the same diploma, sometimes they have wrote the same paper and so on. So I'm not assembling individual atoms with very small set of interaction. I'm assembling extremely complex networks which have some overlap, right? So it's not the same operation as let me start with atomistic entity, small roles of interaction, and obtain the emerging structure. In fact, we have already, with a qualitativist, plus qualitativist and the digital data scale, we have on each of these individuals masses of information. Why on earth, just to please physicists, would we strip out all the information we have in order to obtain atomistic individual of which we know nothing? That's what is called science. This is ridiculous. We have lots of information, let's keep it. It's complex, well, society is complex. I mean, we are not going to simplify just for the fun of it. But we have to be able to navigate. So the argument is, since we have overlapping, individualizing wholes, that's what has to be mapped and not simplified. Okay, and that's the point. Just one example, probably completely invisible here, because I was not anticipating this visual display. We redid one of Bourdieu's study on our school, and it's just a map where the presence of the institution is obtained only from the CVs of the members of the school. So we don't say these guys are in this institution or coming from that institution. The institution appears on the map and is as big as the numbers of intersection between the CVs of the members. So they are no longer members in an institution. The institution and the CVs emerge flatly. So, but of course you see nothing. And actually if you were seeing anything, you wouldn't see anything anymore. That's the part which is exactly the sort of thing we do in this church. So, if we can get rid of the notion, so we probably can get rid of the notion of atom as well as interaction. To mention the notion of interaction means that we already abandon the mass of information we have on these individual CVs, which are not individual again, if you follow my argument.